Spent decades inside the American military establishment. I sat in the planning rooms. I read the threat assessments. I watched the doctrine develop. And in too many cases, I watched it fail to develop when the evidence demanded it. What happened in northern Israel in the past 48 hours is not a shock to anyone who is paying honest attention. It is the operational confirmation of a strategic reality that I and a small number of analysts have been trying to communicate to Washington for years, a reality that the institutional machinery of American defense policy has consistently chosen to manage rather than confront. 300 Khaibar-Shekan ballistic missiles, the IDF's northern command, the operational nerve center of Israel's entire military posture along the Lebanese and Syrian borders, the headquarters that coordinates every brigade, every air defense battery, every logistics node, every command and control function across the most strategically significant geographic corridor in the Israeli military architecture, was struck with a precision, a volume, and a sustained destructive effect that has no precedent in the history of Israeli military operations. 5 brigades, not degraded, not disrupted, destroyed as functioning combat formations, their command infrastructure obliterated, their logistics chains severed, their communications architecture reduced to silence in the span of a single operational window. I want to be precise about what that means because the word destroyed gets used loosely in military commentary, and it should not be used loosely here. When I say 5 brigades were destroyed, I mean that the organizational coherence that makes a brigade a combat-capable unit, the command nodes, the communication systems, the logistics infrastructure, the fire control architecture was systematically eliminated. The soldiers did not cease to exist. The equipment was not all physically destroyed, but the formations that make soldiers and equipment into a fighting force ceased to function. And in military terms, that distinction does not matter. A brigade that cannot be commanded, cannot be supplied, and cannot communicate is not a brigade. It is a collection of individuals in a tactical void. Israel is appealing for a ceasefire, not negotiating from a position of strategic stalemate, not seeking a pause to regroup and return, appealing from the position of a military establishment that has just watched the operational foundation of its northern defense architecture collapse under 300 missiles that its air defense network could not intercept, fired by an adversary whose capability it systematically underestimated for 15 years. While the American defense establishment it relied upon told it that the threat was manageable, the threat was not manageable. It never was. And tonight, this analysis is going to explain exactly why. Before this analysis goes deeper, 4 questions need honest answers, the kind of answers that the emergency sessions in Tel Aviv and Washington are generating in classified assessments, but will never deliver in public communications. First, how did 300 Khaibar-Shekan ballistic missiles reach the IDF's Northern Command headquarters and 5 operational brigades simultaneously? And what does that engagement tell us about the true operational state of Israeli missile defense after years of American investment in Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow? Second, the destruction of 5 brigades in a single strike package represents the most catastrophic single engagement loss in IDF history. What does it reveal about the structural vulnerabilities in how Israel positions and protects its ground force command infrastructure, and who in the IDF planning establishment is accountable for the decisions that created those vulnerabilities? Third, Israel is seeking a ceasefire. In my experience, nations seek ceasefires when they have concluded that continued fighting produces worse outcomes than stopping. What has the IDF's leadership concluded about the trajectory of this conflict that has produced that judgment? And what does that conclusion tell us about the actual state of Israeli military capacity right now? And fourth, Washington's response to the destruction of 5 Israeli brigades will define American credibility in this region for the next decade. What is Washington actually capable of doing? What is it actually willing to do? And how wide is the gap between those 2 answers? If you're watching this channel because you want the assessment of someone who spent decades inside the system and is no longer obligated to protect its narratives, hit like, subscribe, and drop your perspective in the comments. The conversation that needs to happen about what occurred in northern Israel last night is not happening anywhere in mainstream media. It needs to happen here. Let me walk you through what actually happened, not the version that will emerge from IDF press briefings over the coming days, but the operational reality as the engagement data and the physical evidence on the ground in northern Israel currently support. The IDF's Northern Command is not simply a headquarters building, it is the operational brain of Israel's entire northern military architecture, the facility from which every combat operation along the Lebanese border, every coordination function between ground forces and air assets, every logistics chain sustaining frontline units, and every communication network connecting brigade-level formations to corps and national command authority is managed. Its location, its configuration, its defensive arrangements, and its operational significance have been matters of detailed Iranian and Hezbollah intelligence preparation for years. When I look at what Iran targeted last night, I see not a target of opportunity, but the result of sustained, patient, methodical intelligence collection that mapped the Northern Command's full operational architecture with a granularity that only years of dedicated effort produces. 300 Khaibar-Shekan missiles were not fired at Northern Command alone. They were distributed across a target package that reflected comprehensive understanding of how the IDF's northern operational structure actually functions, where the critical nodes are, which facilities are truly irreplaceable, and how the destruction of which specific combinations of targets would produce the cascading operational paralysis that 5 simultaneous brigade destructions represents. The target package included the Northern Command headquarters and its redundant facilities, the brigade-level command posts that those headquarters served, the communications relay infrastructure connecting them, the logistics hub sustaining forward deployed formations, and the air defense coordination centers, whose elimination would degrade the defensive response to subsequent attack phases. In my assessment, the allocation methodology reflected Iranian operational planning at a level of sophistication that Western military establishments have been systematically reluctant to attribute to a sanctioned adversary. The missile assignments were not uniform. High-value fixed facilities received allocations calculated for structural destruction against hardened targets. Mobile command posts received allocations designed to saturate the geographic areas within which those posts were assessed to be operating. Communications infrastructure received allocations optimized for the specific vulnerability profiles of relay towers, fiber trunk nodes, and satellite uplink facilities. This is not the targeting methodology of an organization improvising against a known adversary. It is the targeting methodology of an organization that has been preparing for this specific engagement for a significant period and has invested the intelligence and planning resources required to execute it with maximum effect. The 5 brigades that ceased to function as coherent combat formations did not lose their soldiers in mass casualty events. I want to be clear about that. What they lost was the organizational infrastructure that makes soldiers into a fighting force. Command posts went silent when the facilities housing them were struck. Logistics chains collapsed when the hub facilities coordinating supply movement were destroyed. Fire support coordination broke down when the artillery and missile control facilities managing indirect fire missions were eliminated. Communications networks fragmented when relay infrastructure was systematically taken down across the engagement window. A brigade without command, without logistics, without fire support coordination, and without communications is not a brigade in any operationally meaningful sense. It is a collection of armed individuals who no longer know where their orders are coming from, cannot be resupplied, cannot coordinate fire support, and cannot communicate their situation to higher headquarters. In the confusion that follows the destruction of the organizational infrastructure holding a formation together, tactical units make independent decisions that compound the operational paralysis at the formation level. That compounding is what the 5 brigade destructions actually represent, the cascade failure of organizational coherence across 5 simultaneous formations. Now, let me address the air defense question directly, because it is the question that every serious military analyst needs to answer honestly. Israel's layered missile defense architecture, Iron Dome at the lower tier, David Sling in the medium tier, Arrow at the upper tier, represents the most sophisticated integrated missile defense system deployed by any American ally in the world. The investment in that architecture across the past 2 decades has been enormous, sustained, and technically serious. The question of why it did not stop 300 Khaibar-Shekan missiles from destroying 5 brigade command structures is not a question about whether the system worked. it worked. The question is about whether it was capable of working at the scale the engagement demanded. The mathematics of missile defense against a 300 missile salvo are what they are, regardless of the quality of the defensive technology. Each intercept attempt consumes interceptors from a finite magazine. Each battery has a reload cycle that creates temporal coverage gaps. Each engagement solution requires computational processing time that limits the rate at which simultaneous inbounds can be serviced. When 300 Khaibar-Shekan missiles are flying simultaneously across a compressed engagement timeline, the aggregate intercept demand exceeds the throughput capacity of the combined defensive architecture operating in the northern Israel theater. The residual threats, the missiles that survive the defensive response, reach their targets. Last night, the residual threats numbered enough to destroy 5 brigade command structures and the northern command facility they reported to. What this means in strategic terms is something I have been saying in one form or another for years. No finite defensive system can indefinitely protect a force whose adversary has the production capacity, the operational patience, and the strategic intelligence to size attack packages above the defensive system's intercept ceiling. The IDF built the most capable missile defense architecture available to it. Iran built an offensive package sized to exceed it. The outcome of last night's engagement was determined not by last night's decisions, but by the 15 years of strategic investment decisions that preceded it on both sides. Israel made decisions that prioritized defensive air power and assumed that layered missile defense would be sufficient to protect ground force command infrastructure from ballistic missile attack. Iran made decisions that prioritized ballistic missile capability sized specifically to defeat that missile defense architecture. The bill for those respective decisions came due last night over northern Israel. I've watched the Pentagon spend hundreds of billions of dollars on systems that look decisive in procurement documents and perform differently in actual operational environments against adversaries that had studied them. The Khaibar-Shekan is not a weapon that caught me off guard. What caught me off guard, or more accurately, what did not catch me off guard but should have caught the people whose job it was to prevent this, is how long it took the defense establishment to take seriously the specific capabilities that Iran was developing and deploying. Let me explain what the Khaibar-Shekan actually is, not the press release version, but the technical and operational reality that makes it the weapon that destroyed 5 Israeli brigades last night. The Khaibar-Shekan is the current apex of an Iranian ballistic missile development program that has been iterating continuously since the mid-1990s with one specific and consistent operational objective: develop a weapon capable of defeating the American-supplied missile defense architecture protecting American partners in the Middle East. Every technical decision embedded in the Khaibar-Shekan's design reflects that objective directly. The range that places launch positions beyond counter-battery reach, the terminal maneuverability that defeats intercept algorithm predictions, the GPS-independent guidance that makes the weapon immune to the electronic warfare capabilities that Israeli and American forces might deploy against GPS-dependent systems, the warhead design optimized for the specific damage profiles required against the target types Iran has been preparing to engage. From where I stand, having spent years inside American defense planning and having watched the intelligence assessments about Iranian ballistic missile development evolve across 2 decades, the most important thing to understand about the Khaibar-Shekan is not what it can do. It is how it was built, despite everything that was done to prevent it from being built. Iran developed the Khaibar-Shekan under comprehensive economic sanctions that denied it access to Western microelectronics, precision manufacturing equipment, and the international defense procurement channels through which most nations acquire advanced military technology. The American defense establishment's institutional response to this constraint was a persistent analytical assumption that a sanctioned nation simply could not develop the sophisticated guidance, propulsion, and warhead technologies required to produce a weapon of this capability. That assumption was wrong, and it was wrong in ways that the evidence available should have made apparent years before last night's engagement. The guidance system that allowed 300 Khaibar-Shekans to simultaneously engage dispersed targets across a complex geographic area with the precision required to destroy 5 brigade command structures reflects a development program that combined Iranian indigenous engineering capability with technical knowledge acquired through specific channels that sanctions were never able to fully close. Russian technical knowledge regarding ballistic trajectory optimization and terminal guidance physics was accessed through defense cooperation channels that the Russian Iranian relationship has sustained across years of American pressure. Chinese expertise in signal processing and precision navigation was incorporated through arrangements that operated below the threshold that American sanctions enforcement was able to effectively monitor and interdict. But the most consequential single input to Iran's ballistic missile guidance development, the technical foundation upon which the Khaibar-Shekan's GPS independent navigation architecture is built, was an American platform that Iran captured intact in 2011, the RQ-170 Sentinel. I want to be direct about what that capture represented because I've heard it minimized in American defense circles in ways that reflect institutional reluctance to acknowledge the magnitude of the intelligence loss it represented. When Iranian electronic warfare teams guided that drone to a soft landing inside Iranian territory using GPS spoofing, feeding it false positioning data that convinced its navigation system it was approaching its base in Afghanistan, while it was actually descending into Iran, they acquired something more valuable than the physical airframe. They acquired direct access to the GPS receiver architecture of an American military platform. The signal authentication protocols, the navigation system logic, the specific technical parameters that American military GPS receivers use to determine whether incoming positioning signals are genuine. Iranian engineers spent years extracting every technical insight available from that platform. What they learned about American GPS dependency informed an entire generation of Iranian weapons development, including the GPS independent guidance architecture built into the Khaibar-Shekan, precisely because Iranian engineers understood from direct examination of American systems that GPS dependency was a foundational vulnerability of American-derived military platforms. A Khaibar-Shekan does not need GPS. It was designed that way deliberately, and the Israeli missile defense systems that attempted to intercept it last night were operating against a weapon that their design parameters did not fully account for. David's sling and arrow were developed against specific threat profiles that the Khaibar-Shekan's terminal maneuverability and multi-mode guidance architecture were specifically engineered to fall outside of. In my experience, the most dangerous procurement failure is not buying the wrong weapon. It is buying the right weapon against the wrong threat model. Israel bought world-class missile defense systems against the threat model that existed when those systems were designed. Iran built a weapon against the threat model of those specific defense systems. That asymmetry, the attacker updating its weapon against a defender system, while the defender system was fixed after procurement, is the technical explanation for what happened last night. I've been saying for years that the American defense procurement cycle is too slow, too bureaucratic, and too captured by contractor interests to keep pace with adversaries who can make faster development decisions outside the constraints of democratic oversight and congressional budget cycles. The destruction of 5 Israeli brigades by 300 Khaibar-Shekan missiles is the operational demonstration of that argument in a form that no procurement official, no defense contractor, and no congressional committee member can honestly dismiss. I sat in rooms with these people. I know how they think when a crisis hits. I know the institutional reflexes that activate, the bureaucratic patterns that assert themselves, and the gap between what is said in those rooms and what is communicated to the public. What Washington is doing right now in response to the destruction of 5 Israeli brigades is exactly what I would have predicted from those rooms, and it is not enough. The immediate response package that Washington has assembled reflects the genuine limits of what American strategic freedom allows in this specific context, and those limits are more constraining than the public statements currently emanating from the State Department and the Pentagon are designed to suggest. Emergency weapons transfers are being accelerated, additional interceptor missiles, precision munitions, intelligence support packages. These are real, they matter at the margins, and they will not change the fundamental strategic situation that produced last night's engagement. The options that would actually change the strategic situation are options that Washington's current risk calculus, shaped by the Hormuz scenario and the regional base vulnerability calculus and the domestic political constraints of an administration managing multiple simultaneous crises, is not prepared to authorize. Direct military strikes against Iranian ballistic missile production and storage infrastructure would eliminate the Khaibar-Shekan threat at its source. They would also trigger the full activation of Iran's retaliatory architecture in ways whose downstream consequences the American political system is not currently willing to absorb. Let me be direct about something that I think gets obscured in the public commentary about American deterrence in this theater. Washington's reluctance to take direct military action against Iran is not primarily a function of military capability. American forces in the region have the capability to conduct substantial offensive operations against Iranian military infrastructure. The reluctance is a function of consequence management, the recognition that the second and third order effects of direct American military action against Iran in this strategic environment exceed the political and strategic palatability of the outcomes those actions would produce. Iran has constructed its retaliatory architecture specifically to make this calculation come out the way it is currently coming out. The Hormuz denial capability, the regional base attack posture, the Hezbollah activation threshold, these are not independent capabilities assembled for independent purposes. They are components of an integrated deterrence architecture designed to ensure that the cost of direct American military action against Iran consistently exceeds the political will of American administrations to pay it. I've watched this deterrence architecture be constructed across years of Iranian strategic investment, while American policy toward Iran oscillated between maximum pressure campaigns that imposed real economic costs, but produced no strategic capitulation, and engagement frameworks that sought diplomatic resolution, but never succeeded in permanently addressing the core security dynamics driving Iranian military investment. Neither approach resolved the fundamental problem Iran kept building. The capability demonstrated last night is the cumulative output of everything that neither approach was able to prevent. What Israel is now experiencing and what Washington is watching from the constrained position its own strategic choices have produced is the consequence of a 15-year period during which the combination of Israeli military action and American sanctions imposed real costs on Iranian military programs, but did not prevent those programs from reaching operational maturity. The assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, the Stuxnet cyber attack against Iranian centrifuge operations, the hundreds of Israeli airstrikes against weapons convoys in Syria, all of these operations imposed real costs and produced real setbacks. None of them stopped the Khaibar-Shekan from being built, tested, and fired in the numbers that destroyed 5 Israeli brigades last night. From where I stand, the honest assessment of Washington's current position is this: the United States is watching an ally absorb the most significant military defeat in its modern history. It possesses the military capability to substantially alter the strategic situation through direct action, and it is not going to use that capability in the ways that would actually be decisive because the consequences of doing so exceed what the current political environment will support. That gap between capability and willingness is the most important strategic fact in the Middle East right now, and Iran has known it, planned around it, and exploited it with extraordinary precision. The ceasefire request that Israel has transmitted through American intermediaries is the operational expression of what that gap means in practice. Israel has concluded, correctly in my assessment, that continued fighting under current conditions produces worse outcomes than stopping. Washington is now in the position of managing a ceasefire process for an ally whose military architecture has just been fundamentally disrupted, while simultaneously trying to maintain the appearance of deterrence credibility in a theater where that credibility has just taken a visible and documented blow. In my experience, the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most weapons. It is the one who knows exactly why he is fighting, who has clarity of purpose that persists through loss, through setback, through the kind of sustained pressure that breaks organizations built on less certain foundations. Iran and Hezbollah know why they are fighting. I don't say that as an endorsement of their objectives or their methods. I say it as a military professional who has spent decades studying what makes fighting organizations effective and what makes them break. The clarity of purpose that sustains Iranian strategic investment across decades of sanctions, assassination, and military setback is not manufactured by propaganda. It is rooted in a genuine national conviction about sovereignty, about resistance to external domination, about the right to develop the strategic capabilities that self-defense requires, that external pressure has consistently reinforced rather than eroded. The Revolutionary Guard Corps officers who planned and executed last night's strike package are not adventurers. They are strategic professionals formed by an institution that has been at war in every dimension that word encompasses for the entirety of their professional lives. They watched colleagues killed by foreign intelligence services. They continued their work through cyber attacks that destroyed centrifuges and disrupted industrial facilities. They maintained their strategic programs through economic pressure that impoverished the broader society they were operating in. The output of that sustained test is the operational capability deployed last night, built, refined, and executed by an institution that has been tested under the maximum pressure its adversaries could apply and has emerged from each test with its strategic commitment intact. I've seen what happens to military organizations that fight without that clarity of purpose. I've watched American forces conduct operations in theaters where the strategic objective was never clearly defined, where the connection between the tactical actions being executed and the strategic outcomes being sought was never coherently articulated, and where the institutional confidence that makes organizations perform under pressure eroded as the disconnect between effort and result became impossible to ignore. The contrast with what Iran has built is instructive in ways that the American defense establishment finds uncomfortable to acknowledge. Israel is currently experiencing something different from that. And I want to be fair to the IDF here, because it is an organization with genuine institutional quality. Israel's military paralysis is not a function of unclear purpose or organizational breakdown. It is a function of encountering a capability environment for which its doctrine and its equipment were not specifically prepared, and encountering it in a strategic context where the options available to recover the situation carry costs that Israeli political leadership is not currently willing to accept. The ceasefire request reflects a rational institutional assessment that the current operational trajectory, 5 brigades destroyed, Northern Command degraded, air defense stockpiles depleted at rates that exceed resupply timelines, and an adversary that has demonstrated it can repeat the strike package that produced those losses, does not improve with continued fighting under current conditions. That is a militarily honest assessment. It does not reflect organizational breakdown or loss of will. It reflects the recognition that strategic situations have boundaries and that the current situation has reached one. What it does reflect, and this is the dimension of the ceasefire request that deserves honest examination, is the consequence of 15 years of strategic assumptions about Iranian capability that proved incorrect. The assumption that airstrikes on Syrian convoys would prevent precision weapons from reaching Hezbollah, the assumption that layered missile defense would be sufficient to protect ground force command infrastructure from ballistic missile attack at scale, the assumption that American deterrence credibility would constrain Iranian willingness to conduct operations of this magnitude and consequence. Each of those assumptions was a reasonable assessment of a specific strategic moment. Each of them stopped being accurate as Iranian capability advanced and Iranian strategic calculus adjusted. The failure was not in making the initial assumptions. The failure was in not updating them fast enough as the evidence accumulated that they were becoming less valid. In my assessment, that failure is shared between Israeli and American intelligence and planning establishments in proportions that will be debated in classified after-action reviews for years. What is not debatable is the operational result. 5 brigades destroyed, a ceasefire request transmitted, and a regional military balance that has shifted in ways that will not simply snap back to the pre-engagement baseline, regardless of what diplomatic framework emerges from the ceasefire process. I've been saying for years that the Middle East was heading toward an inflection point where the accumulated consequences of strategic choices made across decades would converge in ways that existing frameworks were not equipped to manage. I said it in public commentary that made certain people in Washington uncomfortable. I said it in assessments that the institutional machinery chose not to prioritize. I am not saying this now to claim vindication that would be an indulgence unworthy of the gravity of what has occurred. I am saying it because understanding why the warnings were not acted upon is essential to understanding what needs to change. The American strategic approach to Iran across the past 3 decades has oscillated between two poles that share a common foundational error. The maximum pressure pole sanctions, isolation, military threat correctly identified that Iranian military capability needed to be constrained, but incorrectly assumed that economic pain would produce strategic capitulation from an adversary whose national conviction runs deeper than economic calculation. The engagement pole, nuclear negotiations, diplomatic frameworks, sanctions relief correctly identified that military confrontation carried unacceptable escalation risks, but incorrectly assumed that diplomatic accommodation on specific issues would produce the broader strategic realignment that American interests required. Neither pole produced the outcome it was designed to produce. Iran kept building. The Khaibar-Shekan kept being developed. The targeting databases for IDF Northern Command kept being refined. The operational planning for last night's engagement kept being updated, and the American strategic establishment kept cycling between approaches that imposed real cost, but did not change the fundamental trajectory. From where I stand today, watching Israel transmit a ceasefire request through American intermediaries after 5 brigades have been destroyed, the question that matters is not whether the old strategy failed. It clearly did. The question is whether the institutions responsible for American strategy in this region possess the intellectual honesty and the political courage to construct something different from the wreckage, or whether the institutional reflexes will reassert themselves and produce a variant of the same approaches that generated this outcome. Russia is watching this engagement with the professional attention of a military establishment that has been studying Iranian capability development for years and has been a partial technical contributor to the systems whose effectiveness was demonstrated last night. Moscow's interest in the Middle East, where American strategic credibility is visibly constrained, is not a secret. The operational lessons being incorporated into Russian military planning from last night's Khaibar-Shekan engagement about ballistic missile terminal guidance effectiveness against layered missile defense, about the targeting methodology for ground force command infrastructure destruction, about the saturation volumes required to exceed American supplied defensive system capacity will inform Russian military planning in European theaters in ways that NATO defense planners need to be taking seriously, right? Now, China is executing a different kind of strategic learning from this engagement. Beijing's interest is not in the military operational lessons, though those are being studied as well, but in the geopolitical opportunity that American strategic embarrassment creates. The ceasefire process that will unfold across the coming days and weeks is an opportunity for Chinese diplomatic positioning as the indispensable mediator, the power that can engage Tehran in ways that Washington structurally cannot, that can offer economic frameworks that provide Iranian strategic interests with recognition that military confrontation has not produced, and that can position itself as the architect of a regional stability framework that American policy has failed to deliver. If China emerges from the ceasefire process as the primary diplomatic broker, a realistic outcome given the relationship Beijing has built with Tehran through the 2023 rapprochement and the economic partnerships that have expanded across multiple sectors since then, the strategic dividend compounds across every dimension that matters for long-term American interests in the region. Gulf states reassessing their security architectures after watching 5 Israeli brigades destroyed will make those reassessments in a diplomatic environment where Chinese influence has been visibly enhanced and American credibility has been visibly damaged. That combination has long-term consequences that extend well beyond the immediate military situation. The broader global lesson that last night's engagement transmits is one that I've been articulating in different forms for years. The technological monopoly on advanced military capability that the United States and its allies have operated under since the end of the Cold War is not permanent, and the pathway to challenging it does not require matching American platforms one for one. It requires identifying the specific dependencies and specific vulnerabilities that make advanced platforms susceptible to defeat and investing in the capability to exploit those dependencies with precision and at scale. Iran has now demonstrated this proposition in two consecutive operational engagements: electronic warfare against Israeli F-35 navigation systems and ballistic missile saturation against Israeli ground force command infrastructure, that have collectively established a proof of concept that every American strategic competitor is studying with focused professional attention. The nations watching this unfold from capitals across the developing world are drawing their own strategic lessons, lessons about sovereignty, about the viability of resistance to technologically superior adversaries, and about the returns available from the specific categories of asymmetric investment that Iran has validated in operational conditions. Those lessons will shape procurement decisions, doctrine development, and strategic alignment choices across the next decade in ways whose cumulative effect on American strategic positioning will be substantial. What needs to happen now, and I say this as someone who spent his professional life inside the institution I am criticizing, is a genuine strategic reckoning, not a press conference, not an emergency weapons transfer, not a pivot to the other pole of the strategic oscillation that has characterized American Iran policy for 30 years, a genuine reckoning with the foundational question: what kind of strategic engagement with Iran is actually capable of producing regional stability? And what does the United States need to be willing to accept and to offer to make that engagement possible? The answer to that question will be uncomfortable. It will require acknowledging Iranian strategic interests that American policy has historically refused to legitimize. It will require accepting a regional order that looks different from the one American strategy has been trying to preserve. It will require the kind of strategic realism that treats adversaries as they actually are, rather than as the frameworks we have built around them suggests they should be. I've been waiting for Washington to find that realism for years. 5 destroyed Israeli brigades and a ceasefire request may finally provide the institutional shock sufficient to produce it, or the institutional reflexes will reassert themselves, the oscillation will continue, and the next engagement will be worse than this one. I genuinely do not know which outcome will prevail. What I know is which one is necessary. 5 brigades are gone. Northern Command is degraded. Israel is seeking a ceasefire from a position that no Israeli military planner in the history of the state would have been willing to publicly describe as their anticipated operational outcome. And Washington is managing the consequences of a strategic trajectory that the honest assessments of its own analysts told it was producing this kind of endpoint. If anyone had been willing to act on those assessments when acting was still relatively affordable, 300 Khaibar-Shekan missiles changed the military map of the northern Middle East in a single operational window. But the strategic map was changed by decisions made across 15 years, decisions about what to build, what to prioritize, what to take seriously, and what to dismiss as beyond the capability of a sanctioned adversary that the institutional frameworks insisted could not do what it has now done. I've spent my career trying to communicate the difference between the military reality and the institutional narrative about that reality. The gap between those two things is where strategic failures are born. And last night's engagement is the most consequential demonstration of that gap in the modern history of American strategic engagement in the Middle East. The question I want to leave you with is not about Iran's capability that has been established. The question is about American institutional capacity, whether the establishment that produced the strategic failures leading to last night's outcome possesses the self-awareness, the intellectual honesty, and the political courage to build something genuinely different from what it has been building. History suggests that institutional change of that depth requires shocks of a magnitude sufficient to overwhelm the reflexes that preserve the status quo. 5 destroyed Israeli brigades may be that shock, or it may not be enough. What is your assessment? Has the destruction of IDF Northern Command's operational infrastructure permanently shifted the military balance in the Northern Theater? Or does American technical and material support provide a realistic pathway to restoring Israeli strategic position? And what does a ceasefire framework look like that addresses the underlying dynamics driving this conflict rather than simply pausing it? Drop your most detailed analysis in the comments. If this assessment reached the strategic reality that the institutional narrative is working to contain, share it, hit like, and subscribe. The next phase of this conflict is already being shaped by decisions being made right now in rooms that are not transparent to the public. Stay sharp, stay informed, and we will see you in the next one.